Okay, great. So, welcome to our second session of this Introduction to Judaism class. We covered quite a bit last week in the hour and 15 minutes that we had together. And tonight, what I'd like to do is cover a little bit less as far as time goes, but get into some more details. For one reason is because we have a bit more information about this period than previous periods. And this period we're going to be covering what I call creativity and persecutions in the medieval, early medieval, and early modern period as well. And so before we do that, what I'd like to do is see if there are any lingering questions from last week. I know some people emailed me after the fact and asked some questions, and that I was happy to take those questions. But wondering if you had any lingering questions from last week before we dive into what we're going to be speaking about this evening. So I'll certainly open that up. And if you have a question, please unmute yourself or raise your hand or however you'd like to proceed. All right. So if nothing else, we'll begin. So when we last left the Jews, I had closed last week's session speaking about the Jewish legal tradition, the kind of expansiveness and contraction of the legal system, right? Because we specifically ceased with the Talmud, which happened in the year in 600-ish, between 600 and 700 in Babylonia. And we went from there to talking about legal codes and how that Jewish practice was established from those from the Talmud, which is an ongoing conversation with different topics, to how do we do this? Like, how do we actually do this stuff? And that that manifests itself through taking all the laws and putting them to codes. And then people, of course, coming and commenting on the codes saying, no, we don't do it like that. We do it like this. And so there's this expansion and contraction of the Jewish legal tradition. What I want to do, but is back up to the historical narrative and figure out like what was going on during this time. So what I will do is right now I will share my screen again with the that kind of that brief chronology, that timeline of Jewish history, just to give us a sense of where we are. Let's see. There we go. So at the brief chronology, and we kind of exited the rabbinic period, and around this time, 600, 700 of the Common Era, there are two major centers of Jewish life: Europe and Babylon or Babylonia, modern day Iraq. And these are different communities developing different traditions. Also, very important to note that in 638 of the Common Era was when the Arab empires, the Muslims conquered Jerusalem. It's an important date to know. And Muslims ruled Jerusalem basically from 638 through really 1917 with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, with a brief a brief, maybe less than 100 years or so, during the Crusades, when it was liberated by the European Crusaders. I put that in very generous quotation marks because they called it liberating. But what they were doing is, and we'll get to that in a minute, they were, as they were liberating Jerusalem, the holy city, from the possession of the infidel, the Muslims. But that's another story that we won't get too much into. But it's important to know, because despite the fact that the Romans had exiled Jews, there was still a small Jewish community living in living in Jerusalem, even through this time, while most Jews were living in either modern day Iraq and spreading out all over the Arab world, and also all over Europe. And as we see here, Jewish life is spreading everywhere, from all over the world, from North Africa to the Middle East to Europe. And this is the beginning of what we have as the Ashkenazi tradition, Ashkenazi Jewish culture, and Mizrahi Sephardi Jewish culture. Ashkenaz is a word from Ashkenaz in the Bible, means somewhere in the vicinity of Europe, and so that and Sfarad is kind of is a word from the Bible that kind of means maybe Spain. It's got that similar beginning of it, but really these are biblical names that are applied to these regions. So Europe becomes the Ashkenazi area, and Sephardi becomes really, even though it means Spain, it becomes the entire North Africa and Middle East. The other word to use is Mizrahi, and Mizrahi means eastward, or Easterners, or the East. And so that's where, call them Mizrahi Jews or Mizrahim, and that's the Easterners, meaning from the Middle East, from the Near East. And you have divergences in practice, which is why you have different cultures, different foods, different ways of praying. The basic prayers are the same, but some of the traditions inflect that in different ways, reading different variants of prayers. Certainly, as I mentioned, foods are radically different. Just as an example of this, the Ashkenazi foods are European, German, Polish kinds of foods, and Mizrahi foods are Middle Eastern kinds of foods. And the stark difference between these two cultures is in existence today, in many ways, although with everybody, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, living together in the land of Israel, that's really blending together again. It's the confluence of these cultures that have been separated for 1,500 years, and so really interesting things are happening in the land of Israel with these two cultures coming back together. But for example, in the Middle Ages, they certainly diverged because of their respective cultures. Ashkenazi Jews lived under Christian rule, and Mizrahi Jews, for the most part, lived under Muslim rule, and that manifested itself in all sorts of other interesting ways. And so that's why I said when I mentioned this last week, when the Shulchan Aruch was first written, that was written by Joseph Caro in Sfat in the 1600s, or late 1500s, early 1600s. He was a Mizrahi Jew, and when that law code made its way to Europe, there were all these glosses on it by a man named Rabbi Moses Isserlis, the Ramah, his name is abbreviated, who basically wrote the law code and with glosses for the European Ashkenazi tradition and that kind of practice. And so you have various traditions and various practices. And so that's just one significant way in which there is no one way of doing Judaism. And so we can talk about that another time, more specifically how that manifests itself beyond the examples that I've already given. One of the things that is what was also happening was the as you see here in the notes, the consolidation of legal traditions and liturgy. We have the first Siddur appear at this time, and this Siddur is the first appearance of the Siddur is actually in a letter, in a responsa letter, where somebody asks the Gaon, the great leader of Babylonia, how do we pray? Like, how do we do all these prayers? And which goes to show you that they didn't have Siddurim, of course, no printing, but they didn't have prayer books. Usually it was, you had one prayer leader who had a book or who memorized everything and knew it all, and he was the prayer leader. And this appears all throughout the Talmud anecdotally. But so somebody writes, like, how do we say our prayers? And somebody, and Sajeh Gaon, who's the name of this leader, he writes them a letter back explaining the order of the service, and that's our first Siddur. That's our first prayer book. And so that's this first appearance. Then you have different variations of that coming over the next 100 or so years. You also have what's you see here, the Masoretes. We have the Masoretic text, and there's a there's a desire for consistency, right? The Talmud has been closed. Jews are spread out, but there should be consistency in our biblical text. And there's a group of rabbis in the land of Israel who basically get together and compare all the versions of the Bible that they have and make sure that they are all identical. And not only that they have the same words, same breakdown of verses and chapters and all that. And even more than that, they want a standard way of reading it. And so they punctuate it with cantillation marks, which are both the equivalent of commas and periods and semicolons and things like that, but also inform, as I said, cantillation, the musical recitation of our sacred texts. So that happens over a span of time, of course, but 10th century, 11th century, things like that. And Jewish life goes on and again is influenced by Christianity and Islam in its various respective places. And the questions like what is traditional Jewish garb? What do Jews wear? Well, Jews wear whatever the people who they're living amongst wear. So the Jews living in Arab lands dress like Arabs and Muslims, and the Jews living in Christian Europe dress like Christians in Europe. And there's no specifically Jewish garb except for maybe ritual objects, ritual items like the talit. But Jews dressed and lived amongst the people whom they lived, and in these different civilizations in Europe and in the Middle East, they were also there were good times and bad times. There were times of success and flourishing and times of persecution. In the Muslim world, Jews were treated as second-class citizens and had to pay kind of like a tax just for being Jewish, and were, as I mentioned, lower class, but still could flourish in their own ways. Christian Europe was a bit different. There were and that depended on unfortunately the beneficence of the ruler, and part of the issue in Christian Europe was, well, let me back up and let me say this. In the ancient world, there was not much persecution of Jews. And this is an important point to make. Why would, like, what we call anti-Semitism, that didn't exist in the ancient world. And the reason is because if you're a pagan polytheistic society and you worship the entire host of heaven, and you worship the forces of nature as entities in themselves, the Jews are weird because they only worship one God, and they don't work one day out of the week, and they don't eat certain foods. Like, that's weird if you're in the ancient world and you're in a pagan society. And Jews were, and the ancient writers had suspicions about Jews, and didn't, maybe thought they were lazy because they didn't work one day out of the week. But there wasn't like blatant Jew hatred, anti-Semitism that we see today. But with the rise of Christianity, you have something very, very different. You have, Christianity, of course, grows out of Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. Everybody he knew was Jewish, and spoke to was Jewish. And the messages of his disciples didn't really catch on with the Jews. And Paul went to the nations, and Paul sold the message of Jesus as Messiah, for the nations, not specifically for the Jews anymore. And because the Jews rejected Jesus, the literature turns polemical against them. So it's not that you rejected the Messiah, and not just that, but you also killed the Messiah. You killed our God. And so that's a big difference to say Jews are weird because they do these weird things that are different. They only worship one God, and they don't work one day out of 7, versus you killed our God, right? And you rejected God. And so that's a major strand throughout Christian theology in the Middle Ages, and even into the modern period, and that Christians cannot abide. And that's when, and you have all these theologies that develop. Well, the Jews are around as a remnant to show what we're not supposed to do, or we're supposed to persecute them because they rejected God, and there's all sorts of theologies that go into that. But all that is to say that that's very different than just being treated as second-class citizens in the Muslim world. Although there was persecutions and things like that, Jews living in the Muslim world definitely were better off than Jews living in Christian Europe. And because of this anti-Judaism that runs through Christian theology. And this is where you have repeated persecutions and massacres, right? I have that list: the Rhinelands and York and England and Navarre and Spain and Poland. That's much later. The burning of the Talmud in Paris and in Italy. Some of these are concurrent or part of the Crusades. So you have the Crusades beginning in 1096, where Christians are going to, as I said, liberate the Holy Land. And who do they find on their way to the land of Israel but Jews living in their communities? And so, let's massacre them too, because we're doing this for God. Terrible persecutions ensue. You also have forced exiles. The first country to exile Jews was England in 1290 or 1291. Most famously is Spain in 1492 and France in 1496. But England was the first. And what's interesting is that England was basically Jew-free for 400 years. Only under Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, 1660s, 1650s were Jews allowed to resettle. So about 350 years there, that Jews were non-existent in England. You have the ghetto that's introduced in Venice. Ghetto is an Italian word for a section of a city where the Jews were forced to live. This is all part of the underlying anti-Jewish impulse within Christian Europe. And what's fascinating here, and what changes slightly here, and we'll see this much later, or much more apparent later on. Jews were persecuted for their religion, right? You rejected God. You killed our God. You killed Jesus. And so if that's the crime, then conceivably, if you would only convert or only reject your Judaism, you'd be okay. If you'd only accept salvation, you'd be okay. But something radical changes with the Spanish Inquisition in the 1390s, leaving throughout the entire 1400s, leading to the expulsion from Spain in 1492, is that even Jews who convert are suspected of being, the term is conversos, meaning you've converted, but you still might be Jewish and you still might be doing Jewish things. So it's not that your religion is the issue, it's that there's something about the Jewish people that's problematic, and that develops later on into anti-Jewish, or into the racialized hatred of Jews, which culminates in Nazi Germany, of course. But being hated for your religion and then being hated for your people, even if you convert, there's something still suspicious about that. So lots of persecution, lots of suspicion, second-class citizens being thought of as less than. But it's not all bad. So we're going to turn to something that's a bit better. The creativity in the Middle Ages is unparalleled up to this point, and only in the modern period has become more creative. So you have major Bible commentators. So people want to go back to the Bible. What does the Bible mean? What does the Torah mean? And you have commentators. You have Rashi. That's an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, and he comments on everything in the Torah, everything in the Bible, and he writes a massive commentary that runs along a page of Talmud as well. So you have Rashi's commentary, and Rashi, he filters rabbinic tradition into his commentaries, meaning he plumbs the depths of Midrash and Talmud and brings all of that into his commentary on the Torah itself. And in traditional Jewish settings, you always read Torah with Rashi. Always read Torah with Rashi's commentary. There are many other commentators, Rashbam, who are Rashi's grandchildren, or Rashi's grandson. There are the Tosfot, who are a generation or two after Rashi, who write a commentary to the Talmud in conjunction and in opposition to Rashi's commentary. You have people, so Rashi lives in France, you have Tosfot in France, you have Ibn Ezra, who's in Spain. You have commentators from all over the world who are commentating on and interpreting the Torah. And it's really remarkable. You open a rabbinic Bible, a traditional rabbinic Bible, and you have like 10 different commentators on the page. And so And Rashi, unfortunately, because he's the first to write a long commentary on the Torah, he's kind of the whipping boy for all the other commentators. Meaning, like Rashi will say something, and then you'll read somebody who comes after him and says, "No, Rashi's wrong. He says this, but I'm going to tell you why he's wrong, and I'm going to tell you why I think I'm right." And like two or three commentators do that, and then another commentator comes in and says, "This guy's wrong, and this is what I think is the right interpretation." Or a fourth commentator said, "Those two guys are wrong, and I want to tell you what it really means from this position." And it's a beautiful cacophony of conversation um, in the process of learning and interpreting Torah. And so what does this verse or what does this word mean in the Bible? Well, what does this guy say? What does that guy say? It's an ongoing conversation, and it's right there on the page where you have 4, 5, 6, 7 commentators from different eras and different locations who are all interpreting things and arguing with each other from different places and places in time and space. It's really, really remarkable. And then you have Maimonides, born in 1128, so most of his work is in the 12th century. He dies in the early 13th century, I think. He is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Jewish thinker of all time. He writes a commentary he writes a legal code. I mentioned his legal code last time, called the Mishnah Torah, the second Torah. It's all you need. All you need is my book. People thought that was arrogant. He wrote the 13th Principles of Faith. He wrote a philosophical work called the Guide for the Perplexed. Wrote it in Arabic, actually. He was born in Spain, moved to Egypt. He was the personal physician to the Fez, in Fez and then in Cairo, of the Sultan in Cairo, and so he was a pretty smart guy, right? So he was a doctor, a medical doctor, and a commentator, and a philosopher. And the brilliant thing about Maimonides is that he was classically trained, meaning he was an Aristotelian philosopher. He read his Aristotle, and he tried his best, to varying degrees of success, to merge Jewish thought with Aristotelian thought, and it's quite amazing. The Guide for the Perplexed. It's a very difficult read, but it's brilliant how he and then he's the ultimate rationalist. For him, understanding God is intellectual contemplation, the exercise of the intellect. That the Bible speaks in the language of humanity, which means that it uses a lot of metaphors. Everything that it says about God is really a metaphor, and God does not actively do things like human beings do, because God is beyond human beings. We can't say anything positive about God, because that would make God too much of a thing. We have to only say negative things. God is not this or not that. That's how we conceptualize God. God is the ultimate other, and the best way to understand God is through, as I mentioned, intellectual contemplation. It's an exercise of the mind, this is this idea is a result of his background in Aristotle, and he changed Judaism. He through all of his works, changed how we think, and how we think about God, how we think about tradition, and laws, and there, as there is to every commentator and every thinker, there was a response to Maimonides, and the response to Maimonides is mysticism, right? So if Maimonides is the ultimate rationalist, then you have the response is mysticism, that Maimonides says that you can't say anything about God because it's all metaphor. And the mystics say just the opposite. God is everything, and you can say everything about God because God is metaphor. And so the mystics see that God permeates everything. God is in everything. And the great work of Jewish mysticism is the Zohar. It's written in Spain in the 13th century. And the Zohar is it's the single greatest work of Jewish mysticism up to that point, although there were earlier works of mysticism which inform the Zohar. The word Zohar means brilliance, and it's written like a commentary on the Torah, but it brings in mystical concepts, the hiddenness of God, that God emanates in what are called sfirot, manifestations and clusters of metaphors, and these clusters of metaphors tap into the biblical characters and everything in the world, and attributes. And so they conceive of the Godhead in multiple parts, and so it's a fully embodied experience where everything brings God into the world. Everything you do brings God into the world, especially if it's introduced with a mystical introduction or incantation. And this leads to Jewish mysticism a few hundred years later in Sfat, which in Sfat in the land of Israel in the 16th century. And as I mentioned before, this guy Joseph Caro, who writes the Shulchan Aruch, and Isaac Luria, who writes a newer newer mysticism. Important word that I forgot to mention is Kabbalah. Kabbalah literally means received or reception, and it's like this is the received tradition, this mystical tradition. And throughout all of this, this mystical, and it's very interesting that the mystical tradition is responsible both for a Kabbalah, which reinterprets how the world was created and even God itself in this deep philosophical experiential level, and it produces the first the great legal code, the Shulchan Aruch, by Joseph Caro. So you have and it makes sense, because if you understand the presence of God to be permeating everything, and everything that you do brings is a mystical experience full of divine power, you want to know how to do everything right, and so this is the same community that produces a new Kabbalah also produces a new legal code. This also, by the way, is the same community that produces a brand new service, Kabbalat Shabbat, the welcoming of Shabbat. Previous to this, there was the morning service and the evening service and the afternoon service, all of which were the bits and pieces appear at different places all over the Talmud and is put in order in Sidurim. But they introduce, these mystics in Sfat introduce a new service, Kabbalat Shabbat, the welcoming of the Sabbath, and they conceive of the Sabbath as a bride that we welcome, and that needs an entourage and needs to be sung to and coaxed into mystical fulfillment and entanglement and intercourse both in the sexual and the literal sense, because everything in Kabbalah has masculine and feminine attributes, and that unification brings about God. So it's very, very complicated, very heady stuff, but really, really powerful. And it's also the development of serious Talmudic study in Poland. Poland becomes a major center of Jewish learning in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. I'm going to stop there for a moment. Does anyone have any questions on anything that I've just said for the last 30 minutes or so? Yes. Yeah, please unmute yourself. You can ask away.
Yeah. Rabbi, I don't think you mentioned the Great Assembly. Right after Rome destroyed the temple, you had about 100 rabbis that were able to flee to Yavne, I believe.
I mentioned that last week.
Okay, but
Yeah.
tell me, what contribution did they contribute, in your opinion, to say, as it were, saving Judaism at that point? Because from the history book that you gave us on the syllabus, it was quite a terrible period.
Yeah. So to go back and to reiterate this period, I actually want to clear up something. That the Great Assembly that you mentioned, that is during the Second Temple times, like hundreds of years before that, and we really don't know who the Great Assembly were, but the rabbinic lore tells us that they were the ones who initiated Torah study and prayer service and things like that. I think it's more mythical, where I think the things that the rabbis did in the years following the destruction of the temple, they attributed to the Great Assembly 400 years before, as if to say, even though they were the ones doing some revolutionary things, they attributed it to earlier centuries to make it seem more older and more authentic and grounded. But yeah, I mean, after the destruction of the temple, they created a portable Judaism. They created a Judaism that could survive without the temple. Now, the frameworks were there. There was the synagogue pre-existed the destruction of the temple, and they were already studying Torah and already having some prayer service there, but only as a supplement to the temple. But the ones who in the decades following the destruction of the temple, they use those frameworks to say that this is how Judaism should be in a post-temple world, all the while still preparing for the rebuilding of the temple at some future time, which hasn't happened yet and probably won't. That's just my guess. But any other questions? Yes, Alyssa.
Does the thought that you gain extra soul on Shabbat, does that come from Kabbalist thought? Like, I've heard from Hasidic people that they say that they gain extra soul on Shabbat, and they have to smell the spices at the end to rejuvenate the soul after the loss of the other one.
Right. So that's all. That's all. I think that's all from the Hasidic tradition, which is which is a continuation of the mystical tradition. Yes, definitely. That is part of the mystical tradition. The idea of and that I'm not sure exactly when that first appears, but it's certainly highlighted and spoken about most frequently among the Kabbalists, or sorry, not the Kabbalists, the Hasidic movement, which I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. That that much of the Judaism that we know today and practice, I don't say practice today, but are influenced by today, has a lot of Hasidic traditions within it. But I'll get to that in just a minute. Any other questions? No? Okay. So I want to talk about this. So there's a couple things that I want to speak about specifically that are happening in Europe and in Poland and around the Ottoman Empire, that part of the world. The 1600s are like a pretty terrible time for the Jews, like real bad. And there are massacres of Jews all across Poland. You know, and where Jews had been, you know, had pretty successful, undisturbed lives for quite a while. You know, it's the Jews in Western Europe who were harassed and persecuted and massacred and exiled in the early Middle Ages. But in the 1600s in Europe, in Eastern Europe, were really bad. Lots of persecutions and it's a Yiddish word that it's a Polish word that I'm gonna butcher. Chelmniki, I think it's called. I can't remember. You'll find it in your history books. But it's in 1648. I think that's the date of them. They're really bad. It's also a time where you have a guy named Shabtai Tzvi, who basically says, I'm the Messiah. And he convinces people. People think like he's the Messiah. He's going to bring about this messianic age, liberate the Jews, bring them back to the land of Israel. And this messianic fervor sweeps over Europe, over Eastern Europe, especially after these massacres. And then the Sultan brings him to Istanbul and says, you think you're the Messiah? Okay, I'm going to kill you if you don't convert to Islam. And he's like, okay, I'll convert to Islam. And so like, what? Where's your Messiah now, right? So that you know, that was an added trauma that the Savior who was supposed to, you know, liberate the Jews from this terrible circumstance, up and became a Muslim, and that was it. And this, of course, I'm summing up a lot of history here, but this was a series of traumatic events for Jews in Eastern Europe, the late 16 and early 1700s, and it was a time of great poverty, of great despair, and this was a time for the and great anti-Semitism and persecutions. And people wanted something. People wanted something to believe in and wanted something that lifted their spirits. And this laid the groundwork for the development of the early Hasidic movement, because what you had at this time were these great academies in Poland, in Vilna, would become Lithuania later on, and most Jews did not have this kind of learning. And along comes this man named Israel Baal Shem Tov with his circle of students, who says, you know, God is within you. You just have to you have to be joyful and celebrate and enjoy whatever little bit you have, and that joy will bring you in touch with the divine. And that's the beginning of the Hasidic movement. It was a revivalist, pietistic movement that came to the people, and all of the Baal Shem Tov's disciples went to all the cities in Poland, and spread this movement, this pietistic revivalist movement, and it caught like wildfire in a great way. And people, I wouldn't say became Hasidic Jews, but bought into the Hasidic lifestyle that even in the midst of persecution and despair, there was joy. There was the possibility for joy and the possibility to encounter God in everything that you did. And it was a descendant of the mystical tradition, because the mystical tradition believes that God is everywhere and within everything. This movement changed Judaism, from one man and a small group of followers, changed Judaism. The writings and the sermons of the Hasidic masters were all written down and published. And this was a threat to the academic, scholarly Jewish leadership, or elite, I should say, in some of these central Polish cities. So much so that they garnered a name for themselves. It's called the Mitnagdim or the Misnagdim, which means the opposers. Right? They didn't even have their name was the opposers. Right? There was the pietists, the Hasidim, and the opposers, because they opposed the pietists and opposed them because the Judaism that they were promulgating was they believed a kind of gutter level base, uninformed Judaism. But this is what the people loved, and it transformed Judaism. What's ironic is, in the early 1800s, I would say, after decades and decades of infighting, and they were not happy with each other. They wrote very nasty things about each other. No real physical, however, they wrote nasty things about each other. In the early 1800s, mid 1800s, they kind of reconciled because they saw a greater threat, and the greater threat to them was modernity and Jews being allowed to leave their ghettos and encounter the real world and the world of secular learning, and the Hasidic movement and the Mitnagdim, the Misnagdim, said, well, we need to stop fighting because the real enemy are the Jews who are assimilating, and that's when Hasidic Judaism became much more restrictive in its practice, because it needed to hunker down against the Jews who were encountering modernity, which we'll talk a lot more about that next week. One of the other things that I wanted to get to is the development, I should say, not development, the actually, before I do that, any questions? Stop there. Any other questions?
Do I remember hearing right that Maimonides was a contemporary of who am I thinking? Muhammad, that guy they claimed was the prophet for Islam? Were they contemporaries?
No. So Maimonides, Muhammad, he was in the 7th century. Maimonides was in the 11th century, so hundreds of years later. Yeah. So Maimonides was living in an Islamic world, in Egypt and in Spain, hundreds of years, and living during the golden age of Spain. I should go back and speak about that, and because I forgot to. I should because that's an important stage to mention. Anybody else have a question?
So going back to, and I forgot the name, but he called himself the Messiah.
Shabtai Tzvi.
And it was just interesting reading about it, because it sounded almost like a marketing scheme, because it's almost like he had a hype man, because after he had converted over, I forgot his name. Was it Aaron? I don't know. I want to say it was Aaron, but it wasn't. But it sounded like he was like, this is a part of the plan.
Right.
Continue to follow, even though like the ship's going down. And I thought that was just interesting. Like, it like mirrors a lot of what we have in society today in something.
Yeah, I mean, like Shabtai was a huckster. Like he was a
Yeah.
real, like it just like huckster, and that's why it was so destructive to the Jewish community in Europe, in that part of the world for decades afterwards, because like people were desperate for a hero, desperate for hope, and he gave them hope, and then he converted to Islam, and then his PR man said, no, it's part of the plan, it's part of the plan.
Yeah.
And they just like you said, we're going down with the ship. So yeah, I think it's a good metaphor for that. But yeah, it's a horrible episode in Jewish history. Yeah.
So which would you go with, like, as far as horribleness in zone? Because we're talking Jewish history, Inquisition times, those 1600s, or Holocaust. Which zone would you go be worse? Which worse?
The Holocaust, no doubt. I mean, just because it was a systematic thing to just massacre and murder Jews. Like the Inquisition was horrible, but at the end of the day, they just kicked them all out.
Well, they did some bad things.
Oh, absolutely,
too, yeah.
Absolutely. But I mean that's different from a mechanized, plan of extermination. That's very different. That's and in sheer numbers too, in plan and numbers. Yeah. But I do want to go back and mention oops, there we go. I do want to go back for a minute because when I said that that Jews in some senses had a much better situation under Islam. When you look at Spain, what we call the Golden Age of Spain, the Golden Age of Spain was under Muslim rule, and that was in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, and things got really bad when Christian kingdoms kind of took piecemeal away from the Muslims, and finally reconquered it in its entirety. But the Golden Age of Spain lasted hundreds of years, and that's where you had people like Maimonides. That's where you had the Zohar being written. That's where you had liturgical works, what's called piyutim, liturgical poems. You had Salman ibn Gvirol and Yehuda Halevi, these great poets, and so the Islam in the Middle Ages, especially was the confluence of so many factors that led to this flourishing of the Jewish community, which was basically wiped out by the Spanish Inquisition and then the expulsion in 1492. And the interesting thing about what happened here is these Jews went all over the world. So you have Spanish Jews who go to the Ottoman Empire. So you have, and that's why they're called Sephardi Jews. They're Spanish Jews who spent years their community spent years in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey and in Greece. You have Spanish Jews who go to the Netherlands, to Spain, first to Portugal, and then into the New World when that is finally discovered. And the first settlement in the Americas is in the early 1600s in Brazil, and this is Portuguese territory. First Dutch, then Portuguese territory, which is why they get kicked out. And you also have Jews from Spain who wind up in the Caribbean, and all over the world, and it's kind of like a new diaspora, like a new Spanish a Spanish diaspora. And it's interesting, I think just a couple of years ago, in fact, that the Spanish government actually offered citizenship again to Jews of Spanish descent who were kicked out in 1492. I think that was a big thing in the news that went around a couple of years ago. And so the expulsion from Spain in 1492 and the ghettoization of Jews all over the rest of Europe, starting with Venice and other leading to other major cities. This is the next steps in anti-Semitism. It's not just hating Jews for their religion; it's hating Jews for their sense of peoplehood. Conversion out of Judaism is no way to be saved at this point. And that actually, we're going to talk about this a lot more next week, but anti-Semitism meets a roadblock with the Enlightenment, and has to figure out how to weave through the Enlightenment and reframe itself, and morph into something different, because with you have the Enlightenment with the ideas of natural law and individual liberty, that changes, and so you have to respect the individual for who they are. But that's and anti-Semitism is going to do that, and we'll talk about that a little more next week. One of the things that one of the other things that's really important that happens during this time is as a precursor to the Enlightenment is the Protestant Reformation, and the Reformation begins with Luther in Germany and in the 1500s, and Luther thinks that the Jews are going to love what he's doing, because he knows that the church has been persecuting Jews for thousands of years, or for almost 1,500 years, and he basically says, I have this, I don't like the church. I think they're too hierarchical, they're too powerful. We need to go back to Scripture and to what discover what Scripture says. Sola Scriptura, that was his thing, and so come with me, Jews, be Protestants with me, and we won't persecute you. And like everybody else who offered the Jews a nice way out, the Jews said, no thanks, we'll give you a call if we need anything. And Luther said, well, I hate you now too. So Luther became a virulent anti-Semite. Really, really hated the Jews because they, didn't buy into his new form of Christianity. But what he did and what the Protestant Reformation allowed for was this interest in the Bible again, because the Catholic Church had all of its structures and had all of its interpretations and writings of church fathers. But when you go back to the Bible itself, you read about the history of this people, the experiences of this people. And that in and of itself led to more interest in what's called Christian Hebraism. They wanted to learn the Bible in its original Hebrew, so people learned Hebrew, and people found like Jewish tutors to teach them Hebrew, and people wanted to know what the Talmud said. And so the rise of Protestantism and the Reformation kind of paved the way for kind of a philo-Semitism, even as it came from a rabid anti-Semite in Martin Luther. And yet, and we'll see this a lot more next week. I'll talk a lot more about this with Europe. And what happens in Europe is that when this is, I think this comes out of France. This with the French Revolution, the Jews, to the Jews, everything is as individuals and nothing as a people. Meaning, like, as individuals, we Jews can participate, but as a people, as a Jewish people, that the Jews are should not have a sense of national identity, which has always been a part of Jewish self-understanding. And so that's why I say anti-Semitism is going to morph, because it, because it's not just that you worship the wrong God, or you killed our God, or whatever, or you rejected our God, but even if you try to convert, you're still a Jew. And even if you infiltrate our, even if you come into the world, you're still, not going to be any different than you were before. That you cannot fully integrate into society. So it's a very complicated thing. Again, we'll get into modernity more next week, because that's going to radically change everything. Throughout the medieval period, when Jews were living in these communities, the outside world told you who you were, right? You were a Jew because you did this, and this was your community, and you live here. And that's the way it was for everyone. And in fact, one of the most important people in the transition from the medieval period to modernity is Benedict Spinoza. And he's a really important person. He is a Jew living in Amsterdam in the 1600s, and he writes a book where he says, I don't really believe all the stuff that's in the Torah. Like, I don't think like God created the world like that, and I think the Torah was written by people, after the fact, things that we all take for granted today and understand today. But that was a major thing for him to say that, and so much so that he was excommunicated. The Jews of his community kicked him out of the Jewish community, and yet he had no desire to become a Christian because he wasn't. So he was a man. He was without a community. He was an individual. And that's a major innovation, like to be a person without a community, to be an individual, because before that, your community defined you, but he was an individual. And in that way, he was really the first modern person, saying some revolutionary things that communities, the Jewish communities at the time could not abide. But we begin to see this transition to modernity, which we'll talk a lot more about next week. So yes, there's a question, Greg.
Yeah, thanks. I know we're ending here, so I'll make it kind of quick, but more of an observation and kind of a question.
Sure.
Through my wife, she's mentioned the individualism within the practice of Judaism, and I'm making like kind of a correlation, but then a question here. So within the different areas of Christianity, to my observation, it's been a branch because of different commentaries or thoughts on the basis of Christianity. But then you talk about the commentators and the different books within Judaism, and they have different opinions. However, it's still Judaism. And is it just because of the support within Judaism that it's okay to have your individual opinion about the practice, and it doesn't cause the motivation within different societies to split off of that faith?
Great, good question. So, Jewish tradition, the Jewish experience has always been, has always been, diffused. There is no one central authority, and individual communities kind of establish their own practices within normative, bounds, of course. And this goes back to the Talmud and rabbinic literature, where there are numerous opinions and they're not all resolved into one decision, and there are numerous ways to read a text. But everyone, basically all Judaism post destruction of the temple is Rabbinite Judaism, is based in the rabbinic tradition. And the commentators have their different opinions because they're reading text a different way, they're arguing text a different way, and they're practicing Judaism in slightly different ways from community to community, but it's all based on the same rabbinic antecedents, and which is why I like to, partially jokingly, but also seriously, call Judaism disorganized religion. That people have problems with organized religion. Fine, Judaism is disorganized religion. There are normative practices, but there are so many different ways of doing those normative practices, and so many ways of understanding those practices, that all that's okay. Like that's part of the ongoing conversation and evolution of what Judaism is and has always been. Right? There is no normative practice. Again, within certain bounds, there are various ways of doing things, which is why when you have people saying, this is my way of doing it, this is, it's like, no, it's not. There's a multiplicity of ways to do a specific Jewish thing. There's multiple versions of the traditional prayer book, right? Depending on which community that you ascribe to. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, Trina.
Real quick, Rabbi, when you say within bounds, are you talking that the basis of all the deliberations, the responsa, wherever you may be, there are specific boundaries? Would they not be the laws or the desires or the way of living that's expressed in the Torah? Does it not go back to that basically? I mean,
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's very easy to tell what's not Jewish, right? It's very easy to tell what goes beyond the bounds, but within those bounds, there's lots of ways of doing things. But it's all grounded in tradition, certainly. But it's easy to say what's not there and it's easy, and what's in, it can be a multiplicity of things. So we'll stop there. We'll talk about the modern period, the development of the effects of the Enlightenment on Judaism in Europe, and American Judaism, Zionism, all that stuff in the modern period next Wednesday at 7:30. So we'll see you then. Have a good evening.
Thank you.